Our speaker today, this is now his third year of presenting at the Greater China Legal History Seminar Series. He's given us great seminars in the past, and we're looking forward to another really interesting and entertaining seminar from our speaker today. Our speaker is Professor Norman Ho. And Norman is a professor of law at the Peking University School of Transnational Law in Shenzhen. His research interests, well, broadly, they're in legal theory and legal history, but he writes specifically in the area of pre-modern Chinese legal history and legal theory, comparative jurisprudence, property theory, and Asian American jurisprudence. Norman has served as a visiting professor at NUS. Before joining the School of Transnational Law, Norman practiced law in Hong Kong in the offices of Morrison and Foster and Slaughter and May. His practice there focused mainly on capital markets and private equity transactions. And he received his JD from NYU and his undergraduate and graduate degrees in Chinese history from Harvard University. So we're very pleased to have Norman back with us. Norman, please tell us about feeding the emperor in Tang Dynasty China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Gallagher, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be back at the China Legal History Seminar Series. As Dean Gallagher mentioned, I've been lucky enough to be invited back. This is my third time. Although I always am reminded, since we're talking about legal history, I'm reminded about the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Some of you may have seen that movie with Harrison Ford, and he and his father, played by Sean Connery, are on a mission to find the Holy Grail. And there's a famous scene in that movie where the villains thought they got rid of him, but he shows up again unexpectedly. And the villains say, "What are you doing back here?" And he says, "I'm like a bad penny. I always show up." So hopefully that's not the sentiments here. But it's great to be back, and I want to thank Dean Gallagher, Dean Wolfe, and also Ms. Connie Lowe for all of their kindness and help. So today, my topic is on feeding the emperor, Tang Dynasty administrative law, and I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to put that up on the screen. So please bear with me a moment. Okay, so I think the PowerPoint is hopefully showing up now. Again, my topic for today is feeding the emperor, a look into Tang Dynasty administrative law. And so I think this combines two topics that are very dear to me, legal history and also food. And I think food is definitely, well, all of us have this in common, I assume, a love of legal history and food as well, especially since the pandemic has us sort of trapped in our homes and probably eating more than we should. So just a quick brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to first introduce Tang administrative law briefly, and specifically a source, a text called the Tang Liu Dian, frequently translated into English as the 6 Statutes of the Tang, also sometimes known as the 6 Rules of the Tang, the Compendium of Administrative Law of the 6 Divisions of the Tang Bureaucracy. To save time, so I'm not repeating 6 Rules of the Tang, Compendium of the Administrative Law of the 6 Divisions of the Tang Bureaucracy every time I refer to this text. I'm going to be abbreviating this text, the TLD, throughout this talk. So I'll begin with that introduction, and then we're going to look at the heart of the talk, discuss the heart of the talk, which is feeding the emperor, right? Who and what agencies, administrative agencies, were involved, and what were their mandated functions and obligations according to the TLD. And why focus on food for this project? Because I think it's a very interesting and fascinating area, and I think it's something that we can all really, obviously none of us served as an emperor, but all of us eat, and I'm sure we enjoy eating good food. So I think food is a very interesting avenue to take a look at Tang administrative law and the complexity of the Tang bureaucracy. Also, I think looking at food is important because there's nothing more personal, arguably, to the emperor or to anybody apart from your family and your friends, than what you ingest. And what you ingest is basically food and drink. And so looking at food and using food as a lens to understand Tang administrative law and the Tang bureaucracy, I think can also help us to better understand the emperor himself. And when I mention food, so this talk today will focus on feeding the emperor. Feeding the emperor, I'm referring to two separate things. First is actually supplying the raw ingredients, and also then preparing and serving the food. So feeding, when I use the word feeding here, I'm not just referring to just the actual act of ingesting or cooking. It'll also include, we'll also look at agencies that are involved in supplying the emperor as well. And then thirdly, we'll take a look at administrative law's interaction with criminal law and understand the web and relationship between Tang administrative law and Tang criminal law, which using the food as a lens allows us to do. And then finally, I'll conclude with some general remarks. So we'll begin with the red part, the introduction to Tang administrative law. So the introduction to Tang administrative law and the TLD. The TLD is essentially the earliest surviving collection of administrative law in China that we have, surviving, extant in full. It also contains many relevant supplementary administrative statutes, which are important because, unfortunately, the individual Tang administrative statutes in full have not survived. Some historians have reconstructed Tang statutes. However, they do not survive in full. And so the TLD is a very valuable source because it contains within it some of the administrative statutes in use during the Tang. And we know that the TLD was commissioned by Emperor Srinzon, reign years 713 to 756, so mid-8th century AD. And he commissioned this work in 722 AD, and it was completed about 17 or 16 years later in 738 AD or 739 AD. Now, for those of you who are Chinese history buffs, Emperor Srinzon is probably very familiar to you because he's the famous emperor who fell in love with Consort, Yangwei, who we will have a little bit more to say about later in this talk. In terms of the content of the TLD, it covers essentially all institutions in the Tang government and lists out all bureaucratic and government offices, number and ranks of officials, their functions and obligations, all in great detail. And if that wasn't enough, the TLD also contains the historical evolution. It gives the historical evolution of each office. Generally from about, say, the Zhou dynasty up to and including the Tang. So it also provides a history of bureaucracy as well. And the TLD was very much inspired by this ancient Confucian classical Chinese text, The Rites of Zhou, which is purported to itself list out the various government offices and positions of Chinese antiquity. Just for your information, and we are not going to delve deeply into this issue in this talk, there is some historical debate among historians whether the TLD was an administrative law code actually in practice, in other words, it was actually implemented, or whether it was more just representing sort of an ideal vision of what bureaucracy administration should be. And there's a debate in the historiography about this. Some historians believe it was actually implemented for a period of Tang in the Tang Dynasty. Some believe it was not, and it was just used as sort of an ideal framework. And the debate is still going strong. But I think regardless of whether you think it was actually put into practice or whether it was held up as sort of an ideal vision, it cannot, that doesn't affect really the main argument of this talk today, which is that through the TLD and through the food bureaucracy, we can see just how pivotal the prestige and power of the emperor was. I should just also point out the historical significance of the TLD. The TLD served also as a model for future Chinese dynasties and their administrative structure, and the model for the Chinese separation of administrative law codes and penal codes. Of course, as legal historians, we always love to show people the actual source, and so this is just an excerpt from a passage from a office in the food service bureaucracy from the TLD, so you can just see really literally what it looks like. Essentially, the basic structure is for each section, when dealing with a specific office, the TLD will list out the office holders, right, in the relevant institutions. And then it will list out things such as their rank, and then it goes into detail for each particular office, for each particular position. You see some green. For those of you who read Chinese, you can obviously read it. For those who cannot, it's perfectly fine. You can see from the green text. And what is that? The green text is commentary inserted by the authors, which includes information often such as the historical development, the historical background of that particular office, some other historical information, some supplementary explanations of each office, and then usually each passage will end with a discussion specifically of the functions and obligations of each role. So this is just the basic structure of the TLD. And I think generally it might make sense to make a couple of points about traditional administrative law broadly in China. And if we ask the question, what is administrative law in traditional China? What is its scope? We have a very good framework provided by the famous Chinese legal historian Zhang Jingfan, who teaches at CUPL, the Chinese University of Politics and Law. And he argues that essentially the scope of traditional administrative law in China is the following. It provides rules on structures, power limitations, functions, procedures of central and local government institutions, rules relating to the selection, the functions, the examination, the punishment, the rewards and transfer of officials, rules relating to things such as forms, procedures, document production, document making, rules on the supervision of state administration and administrative penalties, rules on taxes, revenue, rules overseeing things such as education, the sciences, technology, rules on religion and temples, and rules on also minority referring to non-Han areas. So I think this slide gives you just a good picture of the scope of administrative law broadly in traditional China. And food service, of course, and food service officials are part and parcel of within this apparatus of administrative law. And the general point I want to make in this talk is essentially through the lens of understanding the administrative legal apparatus of the food service, right? We can see that the role of administrative law in traditional China was to protect, strengthen, and enhance the prestige and power of the emperor, his image, and his office. And from the administrative legal provisions on feeding the emperor, we can see that. So you can understand this almost like a case study in a way of administrative law in traditional China, looking specifically at the Tang Dynasty, the TLD, and on feeding the emperor as our topic. Now, before we get into the food service agencies, I thought it would be useful to have just sort of a bird's eye picture of what the Tang central government looked like. You know, it's often been stated by some historians that one of the great accomplishments or contributions of ancient China was that the Chinese invented bureaucracy. And of course, the term bureaucracy and bureaucratic these days has a complicated meaning, right? Because it can be used in a rather negative sense to describe something that is very slow moving and so forth. But I'm referring to bureaucracy here, not in that sense, but just really an organized, very detailed structure of government, and also checks among agencies. This chart gives you a bird's eye picture of the Tang central government. Also, just as I put on the slide, titles and office names, official names that I use, unless otherwise noted, are translated by Charles Hucker, who was a very prominent scholar of Chinese officialdom. And you can see here on the chart, of course, at the top, we have the Emperor Srinzon, the emperor. This is the chart, by the way, of the Tang central government during the reign of Emperor Srinzon, who again commissioned the TLD. There may have been changes in the structure throughout the Tang Dynasty, so we're just looking at this point of time, the reign of Emperor Srinzon. You can see the emperor's at the top because he is the supreme legislative, executive, judicial figure. I think people often forget the emperor is also sort of a religious figure as well in Chinese history, right? He is the one who people believe is sort of the ambassador or connection between heaven and earth. So he has a religious role as well. And so Emperor Shinzong's at the top. You can see on the chart, if you're going down from the emperor down, you see on the right of the slide, the 3 preceptors and 3 dukes. These were exalted posts, basically the highest advisors who gave counsel to the emperor, although often in the Tang Dynasty, these posts were left empty. And then moving down for Emperor Shinzong, so if you go down, you see the Secretariat Chancellery, the Administration Chamber, and then to the left and right, you see Chancellery and Secretariat. The Secretariat and Chancellery were very important organs of government. They handled the flow of government documents to and from the throne, giving counsel to the emperor, drafting edicts, criticizing policy decisions. There was some overlap. Generally, the Secretariat recommended policy decisions and drafted imperial decisions, while the Chancellery reviewed and polished that. But in Srinzong's era, in the time of Emperor Srinzong, the Secretariat and Chancellery basically got together and were located in the palace with the emperor to make policy decisions. Immensely powerful, because if you think about controlling documents to and from the throne, we all know, of course, in many modern corporations and businesses, who are often the most powerful people. Obviously, it may be the CEO, but really it's probably the CEO's secretary or assistant, right? Because they're controlling the information, managing the schedule, and all of those things. Then I think you want to see on the left, the far left, sort of on its own, you see the organ in English called the censorate. And the censorate, essentially the idea of the censorate was to maintain surveillance over the government as a whole and to investigate and impeach bad officials. A very powerful organ in the Chinese apparatus, which served as sort of a check on all government institutions. Okay. I think you can see a modern day version of the censorate, I think in the Republic of China on Taiwan, where an independent branch of government, I think it's called the Control Yuan, which is sort of a modern derivative of the censorate, also exercises surveillance over other branches in the ROC, Republic of China on Taiwan government. Right. Then we move down, and then you see the Department of State Affairs, and then you see all the different ministries. And the Department of State Affairs basically oversaw the key administrative executive agencies, what we would probably call today the executive agencies. You see 6 ministries there. I won't go over all of them, but you see some of them: Ministry of Revenue, Ministry of Personnel, and they carried out work in their respective areas. And then you have what are known as special service agencies. And these special service agencies included things, you can see the boxes in red, by the way. The boxes in red are the ones that we're going to be talking about today, because they're mainly involved in food service for the emperor. And the special service agencies included, if you see at the very bottom, you see the 9 courts, okay, the 9 courts, which included things such as the courts of imperial entertainment, the court of imperial stud, referring to horses and livestock, the court of national granaries, and also you see the 5 directorates above that on the right. Also, that looked at education, palace buildings, and so forth. And then you have some other agencies which I've put in red: the Palace Domestic Service Department, the Palace Administrative Department. And we'll take a look at all of these agencies specifically. So this is just the structure of Tang central government, just so you have an idea of what the entire apparatus looks like before we get into the sort of nitty-gritty of what agencies were involved in the food service. So that sort of is a basic introduction, and now we're going to get into the specific agencies involved in feeding the emperor, what agencies were involved. This may get a little bit, I hope this doesn't get too dry, but we're going to, you'll see just how elaborate, the general point is just how elaborate and complex this system was. Okay, so we're going to start with the agency, the organ known as the Court of the Imperial Stud. Now, stud here doesn't mean, the modern term sort of, oh, you're a really cool guy, you're a stud, right? This is referring to sort of herds, horses, and so forth. And so the Court of the Imperial Stud was sort of the office in charge of all imperial herds, and specifically the provisioning of the palace and central government with meat and milk products. Okay, and you can see, if I may just interject, Dean Gallagher, is the table showing up here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. So you can see here in red, I have the sub-offices under the Court of Imperial Stud, which includes things such as the Office of Herds. This was an intermediate agency under the Court of Imperial Stud, and it was responsible for overseeing and supervising the receiving of various livestock that were sent up by who? By the next office in red, the Directorate of Horse Pasturages. And these were actually regional agencies across northern China mostly, because most of the horses and livestock were bred in northern China. And they were agencies involved in supervising the local horse pasturages. And the TLD even goes as specific as to classify pastures based on size. So you can see on the in the table under Directorate of Horse Pasturages, we've got large pastures, ordinary pastures, and small pastures. And these were the pastures who actually supplies the actual animals, right? The actual animals, okay? So this is one agency that was involved in meat sourcing. Just a note on the officials, I'm obviously not going to go through each official name, but you can basically see how detailed the TLD is. We've got a minister in charge of the Court of Imperial Stud, vice ministers, and there are 2 vice ministers. That's what I mean by X2, times 2, meaning times 2. And you can see various other positions in the table. We've got veterinarians. You can see veterinarians according to the TLD 600 veterinarians, students, clerks, recorders. Recorders were individuals who essentially handled the flow of documents in the particular office. You had also you see in the table there's people called overseers. That may not be immediately obvious based on their name, but overseers were sort of office managers and administrators, and repositors, who were essentially record keepers and document keepers. Okay, you can see the relevant staff according to the TLD 1,134. Okay. The next agency that we'll take a look at or organ that we'll look at is the Court of National Granaries. So obviously the emperor can't just eat meat. And so you also need to eat grains and things like that. And so this is where the Court of National Granaries comes in. You can see relevant staff 562, again, led by a minister of rank 3. In Imperial China, generally speaking, officials were ranked from 1 to 9. It was a 9-rank system with also sub-ranks. But so if you were ranked 1, you're higher than 9, right? So this is a minister of rank 3. And the Court of National Granaries, as their name suggests, as you guys can probably guess from the name, their responsibility included overseeing granaries, imperial forests, the rice hulling office, and also were responsible for official salaries provided by the court, because during this time, many officials, their salaries were paid with food, with grain, and other grain products. And essentially, the Court of National Granaries responsible for supplying raw materials and ingredients needed for court meetings, sacrifices, rituals, as well as the personal consumption of the emperor. I'll just point out a couple of offices of interest. So you guys see in the table the Office of the Imperial Parks, and its responsibilities, according to the TLD, included looking after the imperial parks, where many of the fruits and vegetables grown there were provided for the emperor's food service, for court meetings, for rituals held at court, and other kitchen departments. You also see in the list of offices there the Imperial Granaries Office, which looked after the storage of the so-called 9 grains. And there were very detailed administrative regulations about the construction of the granaries, as well as the areas where grain was stored. And actually, there were administrative regulations about, for example, for each part which contained the grain, which stored the grain, you had to write out the type of grain stored there, the amount of grain stored there, the year and month of when the grain was first stored there. Also the names, even the names of the officials who put in the grain, and every time the grain was taken out, you had to actually write down, sign your name, sort of like a modern day sign in, sign out sheet. And there were all regulations on this. The Office of Imperial Parks Products looked at, provided the imperial household with things such as firewood, lumber, and fowl. Office of Grain Supplies, as the name suggests, provided wheat and grain, selected them for the emperor's consumption. The interesting office I would like to point out to everybody here, as you can see, is the Directorate of Bamboo. And bamboo held an extremely high place in the Tang diet. In the Tang culinary world, it was regarded as a superb vegetable. And some of you may enjoy eating bamboo shoots yourselves. You'll be glad to know in the Tang there was an organ dedicated specifically to the provisions of bamboo. And this office oversaw the growing and cultivation of bamboo shoots in the Imperial Bamboo Garden. The director oversaw it. You can see he has a deputy director. His other staff helped to select and bamboo. And bamboo was used not only for food, but this office was also responsible for supplying bamboo plants to make bamboo products, such as bamboo curtains, baskets, and so forth. Okay. And then we have the Imperial Capital and Eastern Capital Gardens Directorate, which looked after gardens in the imperial capital and also the secondary capital, the eastern capital. Okay. The main capital in this period is Chang'an, which would be basically modern-day Xi'an in northern China. Okay. All right. So moving on, we've covered meat. We've covered some grains, and what about seafood? So the organ involved in seafood was known as the Directorate of Waterways, and under the policy guidelines set forth by the Ministry of Works, the Directorate of Waterways basically supervised the maintenance and operation of irrigation systems, transport waterways. They oversaw the capital's irrigation ducts, dams, lakes, and dikes, And also, we know from the TLD that the commissioner presented seafood from the lakes and rivers. You have the Office of Rivers and Canals underneath. You can see that in the middle of the table. And this organ, the director there, was in charge of supplying fish and fish sauces. We'll talk a bit more about fish sauces later from the lakes and ponds, and also supplied fish to the palace food service, and also supplied certain dried fish or fish sauces for palace ritual ceremonies. Okay, the agencies we covered so far that I've explained were involved, you could say, mostly in sourcing of food. Now we're getting into the preparation and actual serving of food now, and looking at the agencies involved in that. And the first agency we'll take a look at is the Palace Administration Department. The Palace Administration Department. Now, you can see in Chinese, 殿宗省, it is classified as a 省, this last character 省, which technically speaking is also, in terms of 省, on the same category as the Secretariat and Chancery, those two very powerful departments we talked about earlier, which controlled document flow to and from the emperor. And the Palace Administration Department was founded by Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty. Even though it, technically speaking, was a 省, or classified similarly to the Secretary and Chancery, who are also 省classification. But in practice, of course, it was not as powerful, really, as the Chancery and Secretariat, because it really it wasn't involved in national policy making. Its power, however, came because it was the primary agency involved in taking care of the emperor and all of his daily personal necessities. So things such as the emperor's clothes, his food, his residence, his daily needs, okay? And you can see under the Palace Administrative Department, in red, you see the Palace Food Service. And this is one of the 6 service agencies or services within the department. And it was responsible for providing the food specifically for the emperor, and also preparation. So you can see various people working there. What are their titles according to the TLD? Chief stewards, assistant stewards, scribes, dietitians. So the emperor had his sort of personal nutritionists, cooks, waiters, and clerks. So, one person and over 700 staff serving that person. That's pretty good service, I would say, for the emperor, right? And you can see some of the positions I'll just mention. Chief Steward, according to the TLD, the Chief Steward, among his responsibilities was also helping to serve food and wine at banquets, special imperial banquets, such as during what we call today the Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year, the winter solstice, also for memorial feasts, certain feasts or meals honoring a particularly famous person from history, from Chinese history, ritual meals. The chief steward is responsible for inspecting the food served of that. Dietitians, according to the TLD, we know dietitians, their primary job was adjusting and designing the flavor of foods according to the seasons. Under traditional Chinese food/medical beliefs, right? There are seasons, and there are certain foods you should avoid eating during a particular season, because eating the wrong food during a particular season may interfere with the internal functioning of your body. And dietitians were responsible for really having a grasp on that and designing flavors of foods and adjusting the flavors of foods to follow those principles. And the cooks prepared the food. The waiters are overseen by the cooks. They serve the food and help out. There is actually a recovered administrative law statute that we know was most likely in force at the time, which said that when cooks present food to the emperor, they must ascend stairs, which suggests that during at least some meals, the emperor must have been seated above, and cooks were to deliver foods by ascending the stairs, right? Some of you guys may be wondering, what did the emperor eat on a daily basis? I think most historians believe that the emperor on a daily basis actually ate pretty simple food. So nothing extravagant really, at least on simple, on just regular days. His menu would have been designed in accordance with classical precedents. So what was served sort of in Chinese antiquity, earlier antiquity, traditional foods, and so forth. Okay. So again, as legal historians, we like to provide at least excerpts from the actual source to look at. So this is an excerpt from the TLD from this Palace Food Service section. I just wanted you to have an actual quote from the TLD so you can just see how it works. And I hope it's showing up, but you can see green text. Green is the commentary I mentioned earlier. So you can see on the right, the English translation, the responsibility of the Chief Steward is of the Palace Food Service, which is what we just discussed, is to provide the emperor's daily foods. In accordance with the particular season of the year, he must pay attention to certain taboo food items and adjust the flavors to be appropriate for the particular season. Liver in spring, heart in summer, lung in fall, kidneys in the winter. This is commentary in the TLD. Seasonal taboo items shall not be eaten by the emperor. The 5 tastes are sour, salty, sweet, bitter, and spicy. Whenever food is served to the emperor, the chief steward must first taste it. This is very similar to European history, right? The ancient Roman Empire, you had tasters, right, who would try food out first. For any and all delicacies presented to the emperor from across the kingdom, their names of the food items and amount must all be clearly ascertained and appropriately stored and be ready to present to the emperor at any time. Just a quick note about the green part. The green part is what I mentioned about the importance of designing a menu for the emperor based on the season, a very traditional Chinese medicinal and culinary belief, which still continues today, right? And it was believed, for example, you should never eat heart in the summer, liver in the spring, kidneys in the winter, or the spleen in any season. And the reason it was believed these organs were the governing organs of your body in that particular season. So eating heart in the summer, heart is your governing organ in the summer, therefore you should not eat heart. In case anybody is interested, there are some other taboos. You can see in the green commentary, seasonal taboo items shall not be eaten. There were some other taboo items during the Tang. For example, a common taboo was you should not eat the animal of your astronomical sign. So I guess to give you guys an example of that, I am in terms of Chinese, the animals astrology. I am a rat. Okay, so I should not eat rat meat, and that's not a very big sacrifice, I think, on my part. At least speaking from today, that's perfectly fine. I'll be happy to avoid rat meat. I suppose it would be harder for people if you are, for example, your sign was a rooster or chicken. Not eating chicken meat, that may be harder, at least today. Also, in the Tang, for some periods, eating beef, actually. Beef was considered taboo because it was believed that cows were such important animals because they plowed the fields and helped farmers. And so during some periods of the Tang, beef was actually taboo. Although there is historical evidence to suggest, despite these taboos, Tang people, particularly, of course, the wealthy, the aristocracy, ate beef. Right? If you were a sort of just not in the aristocracy, your consumption of meat probably would not be very high at all. All right, and so this is just a passage so you can see the actual text or an actual example here. So moving on, so we have the Palace Food Service, very important. Remember, 700 plus staff for just one guy, the emperor. We also have some other agencies or organs or services, I should say the word service, that are important. And this includes the food service, as you can see on the table, the food service within the palace domestic service. Okay. Now, the palace domestic service was also a very important part of the palace because it refers to the inner court, right? The inner court of the palace, which included people like the emperor, his immediate family, the empress, consorts / concubines, eunuchs, and so forth. And also imperial harems. There are many, some of you may have watched various recent Chinese TV dramas about palace intrigue and palace life. 甄嬛传 in Mandarin, the life of that's a famous one that was quite recent. There are some other ones that deal with the conflicts between the empress and the concubines, all struggling for the emperor's attention. This is the stuff of a lot of entertainment. This is sort of the realm of the domestic service. Incidentally, this is just an interesting historical point, since we've been talking about Emperor Srinzon, right? Emperor Srinzon, who commissioned the TLD. He is said to have been, how should I put this? He is believed to be the emperor in Chinese history with one of the largest harems in the inner palace in Chinese history. There's a Tang Dynasty source called the Xing Tang Shu, the new book of the Tang, Xing Tang Shu in Mandarin, which records him as having, I think the number is about 40,000 harem women and 4,000 eunuchs serving him. Now, obviously, whether that's true or not, we can't be sure, I suppose, but just an interesting historical tidbit for you. Emperor Srinzon is not only famous for having commissioned the TLD, he's also famous for being sort of, I suppose, for his harem. All right. And the palace domestic service and the food service was helped to prepare and serve foods to, for example, the emperor's consorts and concubines. And you can see, actually, from the offices I listed below, Office of Foods, Office of Wines, Office of Medicine, Office of Provisions, and you can see, you guys can see the titles of the people, directresses, right? You notice it's no longer director, directresses. So these were presumably female staff, right? Serving, for example, the female, consorts or concubines. We know that some of the food also of course, was served to the emperor, and the TLD makes clear that the directresses had to also taste the food, any food that before it got to the emperor. I think the names of the offices are pretty self-explanatory. Office of Foods, basically cooked, stewed, seasoned meat and ingredients. Office of Wines oversaw beverage matters. Office of Medicine, medicines. Office Provisions, supplying charcoal and fuel for daily use and daily cooking. And one interesting thing I think we can see already is there is some overlap, right, between the food service in the palace domestic service and also the food service we looked at earlier, right, in the palace administration department, right? And the overlap is probably intentional, right? Because the more agencies that are involved, there's sort of more oversight and less of a chance that one agency in particular can be corrupted. So since we've been talking about the palace domestic service and looking at food supplied for the emperor's consorts, part of the emperor's inner circle in the palace, I thought we just do a quick historical example, an actual example. Let me just briefly mention the example of Yangwei Fei, Consort Yangwei Fei, 719 to 756, one of Emperor Shinzong's favorite. I'm sorry, not one of, the favorite, according to history, consort of Emperor Shinzong. In the middle, you see a sort of a painting of what she might have looked at. On the right, you see a famous movie about Yang Guifei. Yang Guifei was played by the famous Chinese actress Fan Bingbing. And then what is germane for our talk is on the left. You see li zhi in Mandarin, lychees, right? And so it is a, I think, quite common historical knowledge or fun story that Consort Yang was so beloved by Emperor Srinzon that he did everything possible to make her happy and to make her smile. And so we have some actual historical stories. So for example, there is one story where apparently he got a little bit upset with her. She angered him. And according to the sources, this occurred in 746. She angered him by being rude to him, and so he had her sent to her cousin's mansion. And later that day, he was in such a terrible mood. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He missed her so much, right? And one of his eunuchs actually requested, why don't we send her some imperial treasures? Why don't we send her some imperial meals, food? And apparently that night, over 100 imperial carriages sent food to Yang Guifei. The offices we've discussed would have been also involved in supplying Yang Guifei with her favorite food. In terms of the lychees, lychee fruit, according to sources, Yang Guifei loved eating lychees so much, right? But the problem was, as you know from geography, the imperial capital where Yang lived at the time was in the north, and lychees are a fruit from southern China. Nowadays, of course, we can get lychees basically anywhere we live. But back then, you had to transport the lychees from the south to the north, and there was a specific type of lychee that Yang Guifei favored. So according to tradition, Emperor Srinzong actually utilized the imperial postal system. So I suppose this would have been outside the food agencies. He actually used other agencies as well to, and military messengers to deliver lychees to the capital for Yang Guifei. And on the left is a photo of the lychees. Even today, there is a type of lychee in Mandarin known as the Fei Zi Shao, or I guess translated would be Consort Yang laughing or smiling lychee. And this is a specifically prized lychee. Some of you may have had this in Hong Kong, where I think it's more expensive than regular lychees because the pit is very small and the flesh is very big, and it's very juicy and sweet and so forth. Just again to highlight this story about palace food, since we've been talking about palace food services. This story is of lychees and Yang Guifei is also immortalized in some Tang Dynasty poetry. On the left, you have a translation by Eleanor Goodman of a famous poem by the Tang Dynasty poet Dumu, passing Huaqing Palace. I think this poem, I think, is well known for anybody in mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. I think many people learn it in grade school as part of Tang poetry, but Dumu talks about this, right? So, quote from Chang'an, looking back at the brocaded city, the mountaintops, many gates open one by one. A rider picks up red dust and the concubine laughs, referring to Yang Guifei. No one else knows he comes to bring her lychee. Okay, this is a poem from the 9th century. I did want to contrast that because many people don't know of the right poem by Dufu, who is a famous Tang Dynasty poet. And you can see that he wrote in the 8th century. He wrote during the time of Emperor Srinzong and Yang Guifei, and he writes, "The late emperor's noble consort now lies in mournful silence, and once again the lychees are entering Chang'an. From the hot regions, they always follow the offering of red cherries. I'm sure the jade throne must grieve at these orbs of white dew," right? The lychees now, because Emperor Srinzon was basically forced to leave the capital during the Anlushan Rebellion, and Consort Yang died during the Anlushan Rebellion. You can see, just showing you two poems so you can see the two different kind of tones, right? So after, in the 9th century, there's sort of a romantic nostalgia of the lychees. But yet during the actual period, some people have interpreted Dufu's poem as being sort of a mild criticism on the extravagance of the Tang court, right? The Tang court in spending so many resources on trying to please Yangwei. So just two different tones in terms of the poems. The right poem, as you can see on the slide, is translated by Stephen Owen. All right. So moving on, after our sort of brief detour into Consort Yang and the food service for the inner palace, we now get to the Court of Imperial Entertainments. As the name suggests, this branch is responsible for catering for the emperor and also officials and members of the imperial household, but only for specific instances when there's imperial entertainment, namely imperial banquets, festivals, dinners honoring foreign dignitaries, ritual sacrifices, ritual dinners, okay? And essentially in the Tang Dynasty, just to give you some background information, there were two major types of banquets. One banquet, some banquets were fixed ones. What do I mean by fixed? They were regularly occurring ones, like emperor's birthday, important religious festivals. And the second kind was sort of the irregular banquets that were held if the empress or one of the emperor's consorts gave birth, maybe celebrating the birth of an emperor's son, a victory in battle, or even at the whim of the emperor if he wanted to honor a particular official or so forth. Okay, and as you can see from the table, this was overseen by a chief minister and composed of secondary offices, such as the Office of Banquets, Office of Delicacies, Office of Fine Wines, and Office of Spices. Okay. This is just sort of a painting of what a banquet might have looked like in the Tang Dynasty. Now, I would be remiss, and we would be remiss if when we talk about food service agencies, right, if I didn't mention what was actually eaten. That would be a very horrible omission on my part. And so here you are. So sometimes we, of course, it would be natural to ask what was actually eaten, for example, in banquets. Unfortunately, not many full menus have survived from the Tang, banquet menus, but some historians believe actually only 2 full menus have survived. This is an excerpt from the early 8th century for a banquet called Burning the Tail Banquet, which basically celebrated a major official's promotion or sometimes his appointment to a new post. And I've listed some of the foods that some historians believed were served at banquets. You can see some things such as steamed shortbreads, clotted cream, mutton and marrow sausages, roasted shrimp, wontons, cold clam soup, fried fish, fish fermented in milk, onion and vinegar chicken, chicken marinated in milk. And then the last bullet point, perhaps most accessible to us nowadays, or at least to me, pastries, cakes, breads, and dumplings. Historians believe that would be similar to basically in Mandarin, what we call dianxing today, or dim sum in Hong Kong, you know, this sort of small dumplings or small food items, cakes, pastries that are served in small bites, so you can try a variety of textures and flavors without making yourself full. And you can see on the right, I have photos. These are obviously not from the Tang, but they are banquets from restaurants in Xi'an. If you go to Xi'an today in China, there are some restaurants who claim to serve imperial style, even Tang Dynasty kind of food and banquets. I remember when I went to Xi'an, this was many years ago, but I went to one and they served a variety of dumplings, and they said basically, I never investigated whether this was true or not, but they said that, well, this sort of in the Tang, they had various varieties of dumplings that were served, so you could try all different kinds, and they presented them in different colors, and while eating, you watch this, what they claimed was sort of a Tang Dynasty musical dance performance. So it was sort of the Tang experience. So anyway, that's some discussion of food. But again, getting back to the Court of Imperial Entertainments, just to mention some of the offices more in detail. Office of Banquets, right? A huge team responsible for looking after food and beverage for probably, you're looking at around 70, more than 70 ritual ceremonies, ritual sacrifice ceremonies a year. Banquets, diplomatic meetings, receiving new officials, and so forth. The Office of Delicacies, as you can probably guess from the name, was in charge of providing very special meat and fish dishes. And actually, the TLD, if you want more specifics, I can give them to you. The TLD breaks it down even further. Delicacies includes, they say, items from land and water. From the land, things such as special nuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and the water, from water, very special fish, something called salt water nuts. I don't know what that would refer to, and fox nuts. Again, not a botanist, so I'm not exactly sure what species that is, but just very rare types of nuts. Okay. I would also be remiss. I talked about actual food. I would also be remiss if I did not mention beverages, right? So we have the Office of Fine Wines, which helped produce, store, and provide wine for palace and sacrificial ritual use. Now, this is actually a very interesting area within the TLD because it goes into extreme specifics about dealing with wine and what wine is to be served at what particular ritual, and it has very detailed administrative regulations, even as to what receptacles should certain wine be put in, what altars should certain wine be put on. And so this is a particularly important area in the food apparatus. Okay. By the way, just an aside about wines, in case anybody is wondering, in Tang China, of course, most wines, not all, but most wines were not made necessarily from fruit, right? So what we think about wine today in terms of red wine, red grape wine, or white wine, white grape wine, like a Chardonnay, or a red wine like a Merlot, right? So most wine in the Tang were made basically, generally from glutinous millet, and that would be more in the north, or glutinous rice in the south. But that being said, there were exotic wines in the Tang made from fruit. But in terms of just overall in the Tang, if people are drinking wine, they're likely drinking more wine made from glutinous rice or glutinous millet. And like I said, there were wines that were made more from special ingredients that probably the emperor would have had access to, or if you were the aristocracy, such as wines. We know there are wines made from ginger, chrysanthemum, pomegranate, 石榴 in Mandarin, pomegranate, bamboo leaves, some fruit wines too, pear, I think, and grapes, grapes imported from Central Asia, because as some of you may know, the Tang stretched into Central Asia and was particularly active in terms of trade with Central Asia. Okay. Just to give you guys an excerpt again from the actual source from the Office of Fine Wines. This is just a very brief source, but just to show you the kind of specificity involved in the TLD about wine, right? As you can see, if wine is to be presented to the emperor for his personal consumption, then Chunbao, spring fermented wine, right? Chouqing, a strongly flavored wine fermented in winter until the summer. Tumi, a double fermented wine and sangluo, wine made from mulberry tree leaves, shall be served. So we have an idea of some kind of wines that the emperor drank. Within the palace, there is currently spring fermented wine from Ying Prefecture. That place used to specialize in making delicious wine. In the early days, Zhang served as prefect of Ying Prefecture, and he would present to the throne the method for making his prefecture's wine. Now the palace has hired people from Ying Prefecture as winemakers in order to provide wine to the emperor and his officials. So very specific, even where the wine should be produced. And the palace will hire people from where the best wine producing locations would be. I guess that would be akin to nowadays somebody, if you want great French Champagne or French Bordeaux, you directly hire the winemakers from Bordeaux or the Champagne regions to make wine for you. Okay, and moving on, I just want to mention the Office of Spices. This is the last red one, Office of Spices, because very important. They were in charge of spices, salts, sauces, especially for providing for the imperial banquets and so forth. In case you're interested in the Tang spices, there were many spices that were in use, included things such as ginger, of course, cardamom, peppers, salt, which was controlled by a government monopoly during the time, mustard seeds, mustard plants, basil, cinnamon, what is that called? Dill. Okay, these are some examples. Li Bai, the famous Tang Dynasty poet, actually wrote a poem to salt. And the TLD goes into detail about the spices, right? And it actually says the Office of Spices is responsible for overseeing two categories of spices. One are types of vinegars. So, of course, what are some of the vinegars in the Tang? So we know that there were things like rice vinegar, wheat vinegar. There was even vinegar made from peaches. Okay, and then so vinegar is the first category. Second category, hai, H-A-I in Pinyin, which is translated as meat pickle. That does not sound very appetizing, does it? Meat pickles. Basically, what is it? It's fermented meat sauces. Now, actually, so what they would do is they would take meat, which could include meat like land meat, right? So pork, chicken, or beef, what have you, or seafood. So surf and turf, essentially, to use the modern English expression, surf and turf. They would ferment it using some sort of mold. They might add other seasonings in, and it would be sort of a fermented type of paste or sauce that you would use to season. And the TLD says this is very important, and you've got to control the mold well. Now, actually, many of us probably have eaten modern-day variations of this. Have any of you guys eaten things like this? By the way, this is CUHK, right? This is the Chinese characters. These are modern-day meat pickles. Now, they are not exactly the same as what would have been made in the Tang Dynasty under the Office of Spices, but they're similar. So I think many people watching today might have eaten this or bought this, actually, a very famous Hong Kong brand, right? Li Kum Ki, shrimp sauce, right? Shrimp sauce, or on the left, you guys can see this is fermented fish paste from Southeast Asia. And some of you may have had this, right? They take the shrimp and fish, they ferment it, they let it sit in the sun, and it's a very pungent type of flavor, right? Which I think some people like, but some people may not. Of course, shrimp sauce is very good sauteed now with Kongxin cai in Mandarin, Kongxin cai, which I'm not sure what the English translation would be, the Chinese vegetable, green vegetable, right? Anyway, this is a lunchtime talk, so it is appropriate that we discuss some delicious aspects as well as law. Okay, so moving on now. I want to just mention basically one more organ, just for the sake of completion, the Ministry of Rights, which was also involved in part with food production, specifically its Catering Bureau. And it basically again, was involved in sort of ritual sacrificial offerings, vessels, producing sacrificial ritual vessels, food and drink for national sacrifices and rituals, and also set forth, what is to be served and what's the amount to be served, or at least offered as a ritual sacrifice in specific ceremonies. Okay. So in the concluding, in the few minutes we have left, we discussed the introduction to the TLD. We discussed what agencies were involved. And now I want to talk a little bit about administrative law's interaction with criminal law. Right? In the Tang Code, in the Tang Dynasty, the criminal law was set forth really separately. The penal law was set forth separately in the Penal Code, which is known as the Tang Code, the Tang Liu, right? And it's important to also understand the relationship between administrative law and criminal law. And the main point I want to make here is that many of the things, or much of the spirit or principles behind the administrative law on food for the emperor, that is, the importance of it. A lot of agencies are involved. A lot of people are involved. Tasters tasting the emperor's food, right? Responsibility spread across departments, probably in order to avoid corruption of one particular department. That is reinforced. The importance of the emperor and his food is reinforced by the criminal law. So if we just take a look at this next slide, I have listed out some of the relevant provisions in the Tang Code. Now, in the Tang Code, which is the Tang Penal Code, which we're very lucky to have survived to us in full, in the beginning of the Tang Code lists out the so-called 10 abominations. In Mandarin, this is called the 10 the 10 abominations, the 10 evils. And these were listed as the 10 most heinous crimes that you could commit. And the reason they were separated out from the rest of the Penal Code, which listed the other crimes, is because, again, these were such terrible crimes. And also because some of the provisions that could be applied to the other regular crimes did not apply to the 10 abominations. Just to give you a specific example, amnesty. So, for example, if the emperor gave an amnesty generally could be applied to the other regular crimes, but generally speaking, amnesty could not be applied to the 10 abominations because they were just so bad. And you can see in the 10 abominations contains provisions regarding food. In the interest of time, I will just, you can look at this table, but I will just mention the two, the last two rows in the table. Article 6, depravity. You can see one of the 10 abominations, and it includes the offense of making or keeping of poison or sorcery, including preparing poison, keeping it, and or giving poison to others. Of course, poison is your number one threat to a good and is your number one threat to the integrity of any food service, right? And then Article 6, Great Irreverence, one of the 10 abominations. It includes stealing objects of the great sacrifices to the spirits or the carriage or possessions of the emperor. And most importantly, look, mistakes in preparing the emperor's food by violating certain dietary prescriptions or rules. And I think the key here is what I have in the parentheses, no intent required. In other words, if you made a good faith mistake, you made an honest mistake, you could be charged nevertheless with great irreverence. So combine this passage with the administrative law codes, the administrative law material we just looked at. Just think about that. So if you're a dietitian, if you are a cook, if you were a director, you've got pressure, right? That's, you've got to do a pretty good job because you're under threat of committing a great abomination. But this is not surprising if you think about, this is really elevating the position of the emperor, right? This dynamism, this relationship between administrative and criminal law, right? Now, I'm not going to read all of this out loud, but this is provides other articles. So this is not the 10 abominations anymore. This is just now the, well, for lack of a better word, regular articles now. All of which have to do in some way, I believe, I would argue, with providing and feeding the emperor with food. So you can see the most direct one is probably Article 103, violation of the dietary prescriptions in preparing the emperor's food. And so violations by error, strangulation, food or drink unclean, 2 years penal servitude, ingredients not pure, or the wrong season, you're serving food in the wrong season, 1 year penal servitude. Just a quick aside, penal servitude, just to explain, penal servitude is not the same thing as modern day imprisonment. You don't get just locked up in a prison. Penal servitude refers to you're being locked up, number one, but plus servitude. You're doing basically labor, forced labor for the state, building roads, building forts, building walls, or so forth. If the dishes are not tasted properly, 100 blows with the heavy stick. Okay, that is, so you can see the violation of dietary prescriptions is actually covered both in the article 103, but also in the 10 abominations. Okay. Now, I should have been more complete here. Violations by error, strangulations. Now, I'm not sure if that refers to just, I'm guessing that refers to good faith error, but you can see the problem here. If you made a mistake by good faith error, you're not going to win either way under the 10 abomination or Article 103. Okay? But my guess is the violation by error is, I guess the point is you just can't win either way. So don't make a mistake. And then I have some other articles here just for your perusal. So causing delays or difficulties, Article 219, the third from the bottom, right? Or disbursement of goods, officials who cause delays or difficulties without any reason. Presumably, I suppose this could have applied to if you're an official procuring food and you are delayed in sending that food, you may also suffer punishment. Damage, Article 214 above that, damage to the contents of a granary or warehouse or storage area, right? If you don't maintain contents in accordance with rules and cause harm or loss, 2 years of penal servitude. So I think the point is, you know, forgetting all of the individual articles for now, the point is you can see almost every various steps in the administrative framework, providing food, serving the food, sending the food. They are in some ways, they are buttressed, they are fortified, right, by the criminal law as well. Okay. Finally, we get to my general conclusions. This would be the slide, I guess people would say this is the slide that, you know, if you forget everything else about the talk before, this is sort of the main takeaway. So I hope the talk has highlighted the importance of the food bureaucracy in the central government, both qualitatively and quantitatively. According to the TLD, a total staff of about 11,300. That means that if you add it up, there's probably a full staff, according to the TLD, in government of about 11,312 in the central government, and about 50% of those were involved somewhat in the food bureaucracy, which is a big number. Number two, it's not just the health of the emperor, but the ritual importance of the food that was emphasized, right? So we talked a lot about ritual ceremonies and the importance of providing food in ritual ceremonies, because remember, the emperor is not just the supreme executive, legislative, and judicial figure. He is also a religious figure in many ways. Number three, the task of feeding the emperor was divided across various government agencies. And you can see supply agencies were kept separate from food and prep serving agencies. This would have probably enhanced food safety, avoided corruption, corrupting one particular agency and then destroying the whole system. Also, the censorate, it probably would have been easier for them and more efficient for them to exercise oversight. You know, if there's more division of labor, it's easier to monitor people. And it's easier to keep people from doing things that are outside their authority. This way, if you're a cook,
if I'm a cook in the palace, I'm not the one that's actually picking the pigs or horses for food provision. Number 4, there's still centralization, though, in the Department of State Affairs, right? And there's oversight over food agencies by the Ministry of Rights. So there is cross oversight. And I refer you to the earlier graph. Number 5, the entire food bureaucratic structure, as I argued just before, was further enforced by the Tang Penal Code. For example, there were strict provisions and specific articles governing food personnel and food preparation, including the 10 abominations, right? One of which included the abomination where no malicious intent was required. I think we can also see the importance of history in legitimizing administrative law generally, right? The TLD based a lot of its design on ancient Chinese sources, right? And the end result, the last bullet point here, again, I think using the food service organs as a case study in the TLD, we can see that the key role of Tang administrative law, and incidentally Tang penal law, was really to strengthen and enhance the power, prestige of the emperor, his image, and his office. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation, and I think we now open up to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Norman. That was excellent. And you're right, you made us feel hungry. Although when you mentioned the shrimp paste, I don't mind the vegetable with the shrimp paste, but once you started to explain the way it's made, I thought it's best just to eat and not know anything about the method of manufacture. And I'll have to think twice about eating rabbit in the future if we can't eat our astrological animals as well. With the thing you said about the punishments, I was going to ask you what the punishments were. It sounds quite a harsh regime. As you say, they must have been under a lot of pressure. But I think that was all around the world. There's a famous story about Henry VIII of England, who, because there were some food poisoning cases at his court, had the chef boiled alive.
Oh dear.
Punishment. I think someone had died, but I think he had him boiled alive. So maybe that explains why celebrity chefs are so stressed and full of short-tempered. Maybe it's all part of that pressure. Anyway, we have got questions, and I know you've got to get away on time. So can I just start with
sure, let me just get a pen here.
Yeah, sure. There are a number, and if we don't have enough time, I'll pass questions on to you as well, because there's some interesting ones. First, let's start with the you mentioned about the wine production and in prefecture, and that they actually brought people in. But there's a question here about the non-official staff as well, the cooks, the waiters, the eunuchs. Is there any information about them being local hires? Who are they and where did they come from? Do we know anything about that?
So I think many of them were hired. Yes. So to answer the questions, some of them may have come from the capital, but others may not have. They may have come from outside the capital in local areas. Some people were hired generally through family connection. So if you had a sort of a family history of cooks or eunuchs, right, you may have entered the palace that way. I think for some staff, they may have, the officials from the capital may have been sent out, and they go to localities to recruit people, to actually recruit people there. I think, so this might explain why, you have some, in Chinese history, you have some famous concubines, right, consorts, who are, well, they're essentially recruited, right? Who they come from rather modest backgrounds, right? But they're basically hired from way outside the capital and brought in. So that would be a mode of hiring for staff like that, right? For more higher level officials, right, with ranks, they would be hired. Well, in the Tong, still largely through family connections and recommendations. I forgot to mention recommendation as one as well. Recommendations were also used, I would guess, for non-official staff, right? So if a cook recommends another person who's reliable, that would be taken into account. But if you're talking about officials, recommendations, family past titles, on. Examinations were really not, the use of examinations were really not that widespread yet. They were there, but they don't become really widespread as a main tool for recruitment until I think the Song Dynasty, so around 10th, 11th century.
Thank you very much. Another question. First of all, it says, thank you very much for the very clear talk. It was incredibly interesting. My question relates to the characterization of the TLD as administrative law. The content and parameters of it seem to suggest it's more a code of administration of services and the setting up of the bureaucracy. The reason I ask is because the characterization of it might alter the normative expectations of what we expect the TLD to do. If characterized as a tool of administrative law, it raises questions of law and the function of law. But if it is a tool of administration and bureaucracy, then we might appreciate it has more of a more functional versus normative function connected to law. That, of course, raises a whole other debate about what the function of law is and was considered to be at the time. So would you like to talk about whether it is law or administration of services?
Yes, that's a very good question. It touches upon the debate I mentioned earlier of whether or not the TLD should be considered as an actual administrative law code put into practice, or to put it more bluntly, I think that whether it's just essentially an organizational booklet, right, of a list of offices and services, in which case I think this is what the questioner is getting at, is in which case is it really law, right? If it's just a booklet of organizational structures. I guess my response to that would be, I think if we use the framework set down by Professor Zhang Jingfan and other scholars of Chinese legal history in asking what administrative law is, so using the term administrative law in traditional China, I think the TLD can be understood as an administrative law document because according to legal historians like Professor Zhang, administrative law includes rules and guidelines set out for the actual offices and the positions. Now, maybe modern day administrative law, when we think of administrative law today, I think maybe, I'm not an modern administrative law scholar, expert, but when we think about the term administrative law today, we think more about sort of, well, what is the legal power and legal limitations imposed on administrative agencies? What delegation was given to them by, say, the central authorities? What limits are set by other systems of checks and balances within that administrative structure? And I suppose one might argue that the understanding of administrative law in traditional China is either, you could argue, it's a bit different than that, or it's a bit broader than that. It includes that. It includes sort of the supervisory or the limits and scope of power of the offices, but also includes just laying out what offices there are, what ranks the officials are. So I think if we take that broad framework, right, we can understand the TLD as an administrative law document because it lays out what are the expected offices, and it lays out the responsibilities of each office. Now, the question of whether it was actually implemented or whether it's just sort of an ideal form, that's another question.
Thank you. We've actually got a couple of questions. I've got them. Some of them been sent into my phone as well. So from obviously from friends about this, but I think we probably haven't got enough time to go in. Just one point there, the fact that there are commentaries that you showed us, I think that suggests that obviously they were used in some way because there were commentaries put in to explain. But the question I've been sent is, how were the commentaries added? Were they handwritten into the text afterwards, or are these revisions of the text with additions?
Yeah, so they were handwritten. So the compilation of the TLD, they start working on it. They start drafting they start drafting it. I suppose the handwritten thing, I don't know for sure. I suppose the first draft must have been handwritten, and then they produce sort of a printed, because I think I should know this, but I'm not exactly sure of the date. But I think at that time there is some printing involved in China. So presumably there would have been printed versions or easily circulated versions. But the commentary would have most likely been handwritten in. I'm not sure whether it was included in the first draft or added in later, but the full TLD we have, the final version, includes the commentary that was put in. And the purpose of the commentary was, again, to explain some of the historical development of that. So it comprises part of the text. It wasn't like they drafted the TLD first and then 200 years later they added the commentary in. It's an integral part of the original text.
Thank you very much. I think we've only got time for one very quick question, and it's a question about the storing of the perishable foods. Did they really transport ice pieces from snowy mountains to the palace to keep the food cool?
Well, that's if I'm 100% sure whether that might have happened, I don't know, but that is the generally, I think, accepted historical idea. I think certainly the emperor did have means of keeping food cool for use, and I think that would have been true. They would have transported ice blocks from somewhere, and we know that the Tang did have, at least the palace had, right? Ordinary people are probably not going to have this, but they had storage to keep food cool and safe temperature-wise. For example, digging pits into the ground and adding ice there.
Okay, thank you very much, Norman. And thank you for a great talk. We have got extra questions, which I'll sort of try and pass on to you if we can save the chat at the end. I was going to ask you if, when you said the main takeaways, if that was a deliberate pun or not, when you're talking about
Oh, yeah. Well, we're doing a lot of that right now in this world, takeaways, right?
Exactly. So, but thank you very much, Norman, again, for a wonderful talk. And I know that you've got to go off. So we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk today.